Life doesn't come with a user guide or an instruction manual, but when sexual pleasure incentivizes procreation, it can seem like there's a pretty good case for reproduction to be on people's checklists. After all, natural selection guarantees that species who reproduce survive into the next generation, so it would seem plausible that parenthood should feel rewarding. Why would there ever be a problem?
Hot August night and the leaves hanging down and the grass on the ground smelling sweet.
After giving birth, a mother often experiences what is commonly called baby blues, where after obvious physical and lifestyle changes, mood swings, anxiety, and irregular sleep patterns become commonplace. Generally, these baby blues begin to take effect within the first few days after delivery and can last up to 2 weeks. Beyond that, a more serious and longer lasting condition of postpartum depression may be diagnosed. In some rare cases, postpartum psychosis, a mood disorder, may develop. The symptoms of baby blues are mood swings, a feeling of being overwhelmed, feeling sad and or easily irritated, an abnormal loss or gain of appetite, and an inability to concentrate or sleep. Symptoms of postpartum depression include severe mood swings, fervent anger or irritability, a lack of interest in formerly enjoyable activities, fatigue, random aches and pains, an increase or decrease in daily sleep, difficulty concentrating, remembering, or thinking clearly, eating unusual volumes of food, whether that be too much or too little, withdrawing or feeling distant from personal relationships, for example, family and friends, feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, which may be connected to feelings of guilt and shame, obsessive worry about one's own ability to function well as a parent, and intrusive thoughts of inflicting harm on oneself or the newborn. Noticeably, the symptoms of postpartum depression seem to be very similar to the symptoms of baby blues, but an extension of those symptoms. Again, that's generally how the condition presents itself. Baby blues commonly occurs soon after childbirth, but postpartum depression presents itself with a greater severity and greater longevity. Interestingly enough, the symptoms of postpartum depression can begin developing as early as during the pregnancy or even as late as a year after childbirth. Postpartum psychosis is a bit different. It is a much rarer condition, and its symptoms include feeling excessively energetic and aggressive, episodes of paranoia, hallucinating or experiencing delusional thinking, and attempting to harm oneself or the baby. In the cases of baby blues or postpartum depression, it is appropriate to call a doctor, but in the case of postpartum psychosis, it would be appropriate to call 911. Of course, symptoms vary from case to case, and at any point where a parent has thoughts of harming their newborn or thoughts of suicide, it would also be appropriate to contact the proper authorities. Now, I made a point to intentionally avoid referring specifically to a mother when mentioning any of these symptoms, and that's because both men and women can experience postpartum depression. In men, the condition is known as paternal postnatal depression, and experts estimate it occurs in anywhere from 4% to 25% of fathers. The risk of being diagnosed with paternal postnatal depression is increased if the mother also suffers from postpartum depression. Baby blues occurs in up to 85% of mothers, and postpartum depression can occur in around 15% of mothers. Let's take a closer look into what actually happens here.
Move up the road to the outside of town and the sound of that good gospel beat.
The human body is by no means uncomplicated. With so many organs and functions to perform, the body relies on communication via the nervous system. The nervous system can be separated into two parts: the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which refers to all the nerves that branch off of the brain and spinal cord. A signal sent from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system is efferent, and a signal traveling the opposite direction is afferent. In 1906, Spanish neuroscientist Santiago Ramon y Cajal and Italian biologist Camillo Golgi, the same man for whom the Golgi apparatus was named after, received the Nobel Prize for their efforts in discovering the structure of neurons. Golgi had developed a method of staining a small number of neurons, which Ramon y Cajal drew. Neurons come in various configurations, but they typically share the same anatomy. Signals received by the dendrites and then integrated by the soma, or the cell body, and if the cell were to fire a signal, it would travel down the axon, which may or may not be insulated by myelin sheaths, to the axon terminals. These slanted lines indicate that, while the image is to scale, these axons may be any length. In a mouse they would be really short, but just imagine how long they would be in a larger animal, like a brachiosaurus, which had those long necks that enable them to eat from the tops of trees.
Neurons fire electrical signals based on the soma's electric potential. A neuron's resting potential is about negative 70 millivolts, which is maintained by the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump expels 3 sodium ions in exchange for 2 potassium ions, and in this process makes the cell more negative compared to the extracellular fluid. This process requires ATP. It uses energy. Cells contain leak channels where ions will naturally leave the cell in service of neutralizing the electric potential. After all, opposites attract, and these opposite charges need energy to be kept apart. With so many dendrites receiving signals, the neuron needs a control center to integrate the inputs, and the soma acts as that control center. A stimulus depolarizes the cell or makes it more positively charged with the influx of sodium ions, and once the cell reaches a particular threshold, the neuron fires, continuously depolarizing. The region of the soma that connects to the axon is called the axon hillock, and this axon hillock is a part of the cell that has a very high density of voltage-dependent sodium channels. Simply put, the positive charge of the soma triggers the voltage-dependent sodium channels to open, and it is the high density of sodium channels at the axon hillock that repel any other positive ions toward the axon terminal, effectively preventing the neuron from firing backwards. Remember that sodium ions are what sodium-potassium pump actively pumps out, so at resting potential there is a high concentration of sodium ions in the extracellular fluid. Now that these channels are open, the sodium ions naturally want to enter the cell, creating a chain reaction of more voltage-dependent sodium ions opening. This sharp increase in potential is what we refer to when we say the neuron has fired. Before the cell can become too positive, the potassium channels open and the potassium ions begin to leave the cell. The sodium channels close and the cell repolarizes, or becomes more negatively charged. The potential difference is so great that while repolarizing, too many potassium ions leave the cell and the cell enters a refractory period where the cell cannot fire because it is below its resting potential. Potassium channels close and the excess of potassium ions in the extracellular fluid diffuse back into the cell via the ion channels, bringing the cell back to its resting potential. It's important to note that the action potential of the neuron never varies. It's binary. The cell either fires or it doesn't. It follows an all or nothing principle where the cell fires completely or not at all. There is no analog strength of the signal in response to something like a brighter light or a louder sound, but the neurons will fire more frequently in those scenarios. Looking at the anatomy of a neuron with a myelinated axon, you'll notice that the axon isn't continuously covered by the myelin sheaths, but segmented. When the neuron fires, the charge cannot travel through the myelinated regions, and the signal appears to jump between these nodes. These are called the nodes of Ranvier, and the jumping that occurs between them is known as saltatory conduction. The ions are further from the axon at the myelinated regions and experience less attraction to the cell, as per the inverse square law. Not to mention that the ions are actually unable to diffuse through the myelin sheaths and repel each other. Therefore, the ions are more sensitive to entering the cell at the nodes. The benefit of having a myelinated axon is that saltatory conduction, which is faster than if the cell were to continuously open adjacent sodium channels along the entire length of the axon. Another thing to note is that all those sodium channels would involve more ions, which is more work for the sodium-potassium pump and ultimately requires the use of more ATP or more energy. However, the opening of potassium channels diminishes the strength of the signal, so it is important that the nodes exist in order to allow sodium ions to enter and rejuvenate the signal. Without the nodes of Ranvier, the myelin sheath would be ineffective. At the end of the axon, there is a gap between the axon terminals and the dendrites, or soma, of the next neuron, since not all neurons have dendrites. This gap is called a synapse, and there are two different types of synapses, electrical and chemical. Electrical synapses communicate electrical signals between neurons, while chemical synapses allow for the transmission of more complex messages with the use of neurotransmitters. A voltage-gated calcium ion channel triggers the release of neurotransmitters via exocytosis. These neurotransmitters can be sorted into 3 groups: inhibitory neurotransmitters, excitatory neurotransmitters, and modulatory neurotransmitters. Focusing on the first two, these are what play a role in integration of a signal. An excitatory postsynaptic potential, EPSP, and an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, IPSP, are responsible for depolarization and hyperpolarization respectively. Not all stimuli result in an active potential. Spatial summation is the summing of potentials in the soma. The cell integrates various signals to either reach threshold potential and fire, or not reach threshold and return to resting potential. It's like Congress, voting on a bill. Modulatory neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin are what play an important role in executive functions of the brain, such as attention, cognition, or experiencing emotions. The human brain, on average, has about 86 billion neurons and is a very complex structure. A strategy of genetically altering mice was employed to allow their neurons to randomly synthesize various fluorescent proteins and have a unique color. This technique aptly named Brainbow, shows just how many neurons are simultaneously active and interconnected. So now I'll be talking about the limbic system, which is a group of structures that play an important role in regulating emotions. Interestingly enough, the experts can't agree on a complete list of structures in the limbic system, but the most important structures are the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. The thalamus serves as the hub for the senses, with the exception of the sense of smell. The thalamus also plays a role in regulating the feelings of drowsiness and wakefulness. The hypothalamus sits below the thalamus and plays a role in regulating hormones. The amygdala, when stimulated, produces feelings of regression and fear, and when impaired, the amygdala is responsible for creating a mellow state with careless and reckless behaviors. The hippocampus is a key player in the formation of long-term memories from short-term memories. Already looking at these structures and their functions, it's easy to see how they might interact. The hippocampus and thalamus are responsible for our capability to feel emotion based on a memory. This applies to both pleasurable and traumatic experiences. You can see how the thalamus might be involved in insomnia and lethargy. The amygdala may produce abnormal feelings of anger or violent tendencies. In the case of a pregnant woman, you can see how important the hypothalamus is in its role of regulating hormones. The limbic system interacts more with the frontal lobe when under stress. The frontal lobe contributes to motivation, cognition, and pleasure. When the limbic system is unable to self-regulate, whether that be due to stress or experiencing the effects of hormones, the frontal lobe exhausts itself, trying to take control of the limbic system, and this is what results in the loss of motivation, cognition, and pleasure. The limbic system sits right on top of the brainstem, which is responsible for supplying much of the brain's serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, which are found to be at abnormal levels in people suffering from major depressive disorder. The brain also may experience unusual changes due to neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to adapt or change in response to experiences. This is why someone who has a history of depression or other mood disorders is at greater risk of suffering from postpartum depression, and someone who suffers from postpartum depression is at a greater risk of suffering from depression or other mood disorders later in life. Again, this is not the only factor. Women can experience postpartum depression as a consequence of the hormones they experience from pregnancy. It's also not hard to imagine the many different causes of stress for a new parent. Factors may include financial instability, an unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, complications with the pregnancy or with the baby's health, a poor or non-existent relationship with a significant other, alcohol or drug use, becoming pregnant at a young age, expecting one child but having twins or triplets instead, or recent stressful experiences such as a job loss, the death of a loved one, or serious illness.
Sits a ragged tent where there ain't no trees.
Postpartum depression can be treated in a number of different ways. Group therapy and support groups help parents connect with others who have had similar experiences and realize that they are not alone. Cognitive behavioral therapy aims to alter negative emotional responses, behaviors, and thought processes to produce a more positive outlook on life. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, may be prescribed. Serotonin is a transmitter responsible for feelings of happiness. SSRIs inhibit the axon terminal's ability to allow serotonin molecules to re-enter the cell via endocytosis, leaving more molecules in the synapse. Someone suffering from postpartum depression can always find a relaxing pastime to reduce stress and reach out to friends and family for help. Thank you for watching this video. All sources can be found in the description.